April 7, 1960. Moscow. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, Deputy Chief of the Foreign Liaison Department of the Soviet State Committee for Science and Technology, made a choice that would alter the course of the Cold War. He was 32 years old, a decorated military officer with access to the Kremlin's most classified secrets. He had survived Stalin's purges. He had served with distinction in the Soviet Army. He held the rank of colonel in the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. By all official accounts, he was a loyal Soviet officer, a patriot of the state. But loyalty to the state meant nothing when the state was doomed. Through his position in the GRU's Foreign Liaison Department, Penkovsky had access to classified reports detailing the true state of Soviet military capabilities. These were not propaganda documents or official state statistics designed for public consumption. These were internal assessments, brutal, honest evaluations of Soviet weapon systems, production capacity, and strategic posture. When he began cross-referencing these internal Soviet assessments with what Western intelligence estimated about Soviet strength, the disparity was not merely significant. It was catastrophic. It was, in fact, far worse than the West feared. The numbers didn't lie. They screamed a single message. The Soviet Union was losing the Cold War before it had truly begun. Soviet synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of any modern military, was chronically inadequate. Since the end of World War II, Soviet oil fields had been producing at declining rates. The major fields in the Caucasus were aging. New discoveries in western Siberia remained underdeveloped due to lack of investment capital and technological expertise. Soviet engineers, despite their brilliance in certain areas, simply could not match American petroleum refining efficiency. An American refinery could produce 67% of the world's oil supply from a smaller industrial base than the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Soviet refineries struggled with quality control and production bottlenecks. Soviet electronics manufacturing lagged Western capabilities by 5 to 7 years. Soviet missile guidance systems relied on vacuum tubes, while American systems were transitioning to integrated circuits. Soviet computers were primitive compared to American machines. The gap wasn't narrowing. It was widening. American technological advancement was accelerating while Soviet science, constrained by centralized planning and ideological restrictions, moved with glacial slowness. Most damning of all, Soviet ICBM capability was a fraction of what Western intelligence believed. The Kremlin had published inflated statistics about missile production. The Americans, fearful and conservative in their estimates, had believed Soviet propaganda about their own strength. Penkovsky's documents proved the truth was far different. The Soviet Union had, at most, a handful of operational intercontinental ballistic missiles. The famous missile gap that had terrified American policymakers for years was entirely fabricated. It existed only in Western minds, a phantom threat conjured by Soviet disinformation and American paranoia. So on that April morning in 1960, Oleg Penkovsky made his decision. He could no longer serve a system he knew was dying. He walked into the American embassy in Moscow and requested asylum. The Americans, suspicious of a KGB trap, turned him away. He then approached the British. MI6 was cautious but intrigued by credentials and his knowledge. By late April, preliminary contact had been established. By May, the most productive espionage operation of the entire Cold War was underway. Over the next 27 months, from May 1960 to August 1962, Penkovsky executed an extraordinary intelligence operation. Working with CIA case officer Joe Bulick and British handler Janet and Chisholm, Penkovsky photographed thousands of pages of classified Soviet military documents. He provided technical specifications for Soviet weapon systems, including the R-7 ICBM, the T-54 tank, Soviet air defense systems, and strategic doctrine. He revealed deployment patterns of Soviet forces across Eastern Europe and Western Russia. He detailed the organizational structure of Soviet Strategic Command, exposing redundancies, inefficiencies, and chronic command and control problems. But the most valuable intelligence he provided, the intelligence that would shape American strategic thinking for the next 30 years, was documentation proving that the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was fundamentally irreversibly inferior to American capabilities. American intelligence had been plagued by uncertainty. In June 1961, CIA estimates suggested the Soviet Union possessed between 150 to 200 operational intercontinental ballistic missiles. Some hawkish analysts argued the number was higher. Others were more conservative, but still terrified. The Pentagon feared that Soviet industrial capacity might eclipse American production within 5 years. President John F. Kennedy himself had campaigned in 1960 on the need to close the missile gap. The figure haunted Washington. It shaped budgets. It drove military strategy. It influenced diplomatic calculations. Then Penkovsky's photographs arrived. The documents showed the truth. The Soviet Union possessed approximately 4 operational ICBMs. Not 150. Not 200. 4. The missile gap didn't exist. It had never existed. It was a phantom born from Soviet boasting and American fear. America's nuclear superiority wasn't merely significant. It was overwhelming. It was, in the technical language of strategic analysis, absolutely decisive. Penkovsky's intelligence didn't just correct American estimates. It transformed American strategic understanding. The containment doctrine that had guided American foreign policy since 1947 suddenly became not merely viable, but nearly inevitable in its success. The Soviet Union, despite its propaganda, despite its apparent military menace, was fundamentally weaker than Western perception suggested. The economic constraints that had shaped Soviet development since the 1920s, the chronic shortage of capital, the inefficiency of central planning, the technological gap, these constraints were not temporary problems to be overcome. They were structural features of the system itself. October 16, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment humanity came closest to nuclear annihilation. Penkovsky's intelligence became absolutely critical. When Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered intermediate-range ballistic missiles deployed to Cuba, American intelligence analysts needed to make precise calculations about the threat these weapons posed. They needed to know flight times, accuracy ratings, payload capacity, and operational readiness. President Kennedy and his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, sat in the Oval Office, surrounded by photographs and technical specifications. Much of this information came from Penkovsky's documents. American analysts could calculate exactly how long American cities would have between missile launch and impact. They could determine whether Soviet missiles in Cuba could reach Washington or merely Miami. They could assess the probability of Soviet launch under various scenarios. This information was essential. It provided the confidence that American naval blockade and diplomatic pressure could succeed. Kennedy could negotiate from a position of absolute certainty about Soviet capabilities. He knew, with precision based on Penkovsky's documents, that the Soviet Union blinked first because the Soviet Union was the weaker power. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles because he understood that American superiority was complete. The documents Penkovsky had photographed in Moscow, the technical specifications he had copied and passed his handlers, those documents sat in briefing rooms during the 13 days that determined whether nuclear war would occur or be avoided. Penkovsky's intelligence wasn't peripheral to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was central to American decision-making. But here is what Penkovsky understood and what American intelligence confirmed through his documents. The Soviet Union was not merely behind the West. It was in profound technological and industrial decline relative to the West, with the gap accelerating rather than narrowing. In his debriefings, conducted secretly in London where he had been smuggled under diplomatic cover, Penkovsky was explicit about the Soviet condition. He told his handlers that Soviet military-industrial capacity simply could not compete with the West over any extended time frame. The Soviet economy was approximately one-third the size of the American economy, yet it was attempting to maintain military parity with an adversary whose technological superiority was accelerating exponentially. The mathematics of Soviet decline were written into every weapon specification he revealed, every production quota he documented, every technical limitation he described. Soviet aircraft engines, for instance, required overhauls after 500 flight hours. American engines operated reliably for 2,000 hours. Soviet radar systems were so unreliable that operators maintained manual backup systems. American radar was fully automated and far more accurate. Soviet submarines, despite their numbers, were so loud that American anti-submarine warfare systems could detect them from vast distances. American submarines were relatively silent. The gap existed in every category of military hardware. It wasn't the result of temporary production problems or insufficient budget allocation. It reflected fundamental differences in industrial capability and technological sophistication. Soviet agricultural production, despite the country's vast territory and resources, was chronically insufficient. The Soviet state had to import grain. This was supposed to be hidden from the Soviet people, but the fact that a supposedly communist workers' paradise had to purchase food from capitalist nations was a humiliation the regime could barely conceal. Meanwhile, American agriculture, using mechanized methods and capitalist incentives, produced surplus food that was exported worldwide and consumed domestically with such abundance that food waste was endemic. Soviet consumer goods production was a national embarrassment. Soviet citizens waited years to purchase automobiles. In America, families owned multiple cars. Soviet apartments were cramped concrete boxes. American suburban homes were spacious and comfortable. Soviet stores had empty shelves. American supermarkets overflowed with products. The disparity wasn't merely economic. It was visible and humiliating. By late 1962, when Penkovsky was providing intelligence on Soviet capabilities during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he already understood with absolute clarity something that the Kremlin refused to accept. The Cold War was already decided. The Soviet Union had not yet lost militarily, but it had already lost economically, industrially, technologically, in every category that mattered for sustained competition between superpowers. They simply hadn't surrendered yet. Penkovsky told his British handler, Janet and Chisholm, something that would later be documented in British intelligence files. The Soviet system is a terminally ill patient. We are treating symptoms while the disease kills us. Your system is producing abundance. Our system is producing scarcity disguised as statistics. We measure our achievements in propaganda. You measure yours in production. This is why we have already lost. In another debriefing, Penkovsky was more blunt. American productivity, American technology, American wealth. These things are incomparable to Soviet capabilities. The gap widens every year. In 10 years, perhaps less, the disparity will be so great that the entire facade of Soviet strength will collapse. The regime knows this. The military knows this. Only the people are kept ignorant. These assessments were not the opinions of a dissident expressing political disagreement. These were the technical conclusions of a Soviet military officer analyzing production statistics, weapons capabilities, and industrial capacity. Penkovsky was describing not ideology but mathematics, not politics but physics. August 3, 1962, the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, received a report from one of its counterintelligence officers. Suspicious activity had been detected around Colonel Penkovsky. Communications intercepts suggested espionage. His apartment was placed under surveillance. His telephone was tapped. His movements were tracked. The investigation accelerated. Soviet counterintelligence was brutal and efficient. By August 22, 1962, Oleg Penkovsky was arrested at his Moscow apartment. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents had been photographed. Meetings with Western intelligence officers had been monitored. His conversations had been recorded. The case was clear. The trial was brief. Soviet justice was swift for cases of treason. Penkovsky was charged with high treason, espionage on behalf of American and British intelligence services, and betrayal of state secrets. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence was mandatory. On May 16, 1963, Oleg Penkovsky was executed by firing squad at Lubyanka prison in Moscow. He was 34 years old. He never received a pardon. He never received clemency. He died convicted of betraying the Soviet state. He never lived to see his prophecy fulfilled. He never witnessed the vindication of his warnings about Soviet weakness. He died believing the Soviet Union would endure, not understanding that the system he had exposed as fundamentally flawed would collapse within 3 decades, yet his intelligence echoed through Western strategic planning for decades. The CIA understood, through Penkovsky's documents and debriefings, that containment would work, that patience would outlast the Soviet system, that the Soviet economy, constrained by military spending and technological backwardness, would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. The Strategic Air Command, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the State Department, all understood from Penkovsky's evidence that the Cold War would not be decided by military conflict. It would be decided by economic exhaustion. Penkovsky didn't just steal blueprints. He provided the evidence that the Cold War had already been won by the West, won not through military superiority alone, but through economic and industrial dominance so complete that the Soviet Union could never compete. The American economy could produce consumer goods for its population while maintaining overwhelming military superiority. The Soviet economy had to choose: feed its people or maintain its military. It could not do both. Eventually, it could do neither. The implications of Penkovsky's intelligence guided American strategy through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through the Vietnam War, through the 1970s détente, through the renewed Cold War tensions of the 1980s. Presidents from Kennedy to Reagan used the knowledge provided by Penkovsky's documents to make strategic decisions. The American government understood, because Penkovsky had provided proof, that Soviet collapse was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. The only question was timing. November 26, 1991. 28 years after Penkovsky's execution, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The Russian flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. An empire that had terrified the Western world for 70 years simply ceased to exist. It did not fall to military defeat. It did not fall to invasion. It fell to its own internal contradictions, to the structural flaws that Penkovsky had documented and exposed in those photographs and debriefings conducted in 1960 and 1961. Penkovsky had been right. The Cold War wasn't won in battlefields. It wasn't won by military confrontation. It was won in laboratories and refineries and factories. It was won by systems that could produce abundance, while an adversary struggled to produce necessity. It was won by technological innovation, by economic efficiency, by the simple fact that capitalism, despite its flaws, could outproduce communism by a factor so vast that no amount of propaganda could conceal it. In 1960, when Oleg Penkovsky walked into the American embassy seeking asylum, he carried with him the evidence of inevitable Soviet defeat. He carried photographs and specifications that proved the Soviet Union was not the rising superpower Western fears suggested. He was a man who understood that his own state was dying, that its death was merely a matter of time and mathematics. The world just needed decades to catch up with what he already knew. Penkovsky was executed in 1963. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. 30 years elapsed between his death and the vindication of his assessment. In the interim, millions of people lived under communism, millions of families were separated by the Berlin Wall, millions of lives were constrained by ideology and secret police and economic scarcity. Penkovsky's warnings, had they been heeded by Soviet leaders, might have accelerated reform and prevented decades of suffering. But the Kremlin could not hear truth from its own citizens. It could only hear propaganda from its own mouth. So Penkovsky died, unknown to the Soviet people, executed as a traitor for telling the truth about his own country. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, who would preside over the Soviet Union's final collapse, was not even aware of Penkovsky's warnings until after the Cold War had ended. When informed of Penkovsky's intelligence work and assessments, Gorbachev reportedly said, "He saw what we were too blind to see. He understood what we were too proud to admit. If we had listened to such voices instead of silencing them, history might have taken a different path." But history took the path it did. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of military defeat, but because of economic exhaustion and technological inadequacy, exactly as Penkovsky had predicted. The documents he photographed, the specifications he revealed, the technical assessments he provided, they were all vindicated by the collapse of 1991. Every limitation he had identified in Soviet weapon systems, every inefficiency he had noted in Soviet production, every gap he had measured between Soviet and American capabilities. All of these proved to be harbingers of a system approaching its end. Oleg Penkovsky was not remembered as a hero in his own country. Soviet history books, even after the Cold War ended, barely mention him. American intelligence archives kept his files classified for decades. But historians and strategic analysts understood. Penkovsky was perhaps the most consequential spy of the Cold War, not because his intelligence was dramatic or exciting, but because his evidence confirmed what the West needed to believe, that patience and containment would ultimately prevail, that the Soviet system carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. A Soviet colonel looked at American nuclear blueprints and Soviet missile specifications. He compared the two. He saw the mathematics of decline written in every measurement, every specification, every technical parameter. He understood that his own country was already lost, that the Cold War had already been decided, that it was merely a matter of time before the facade collapsed. He chose to tell the West what he already knew. He chose to bear witness to truth, even knowing it would cost him his life. He was right, and history proved him right.